Those of you that missed the tailgate this morning, we're glad you at least got here for the main session here. Glad you're here. So we're welcoming Darren Marshall here from Salt Lake Community College. He's the Associate Vice President of Budgeting and Planning. We're glad to have him here to present. So he'll have about half an hour to talk and present to us, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So about 45 minutes total. So turn the time over to Darren. So.
Thank you. So I started losing my voice last night, so I'm like, extra water, so I hope to make it through okay. I noticed that A students are in the back. That's how we're doing it, right? Yay! Many good friends here at UVU. A little bit about, I'm going to go into some of my background and some of my interests, but I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and go through some of these slides. This is a painting. It's actually not a painting. It's mixed medium art. And it's called The Dream of the Ouroboros. And I purchased this. It sits in my office. And it helps remind me that kind of the organization, but it's kind of chaotic. But I really love it. My coworker thinks it looks like Donald Trump's hair. So anyway. My background is audit, and then I moved into budget and planning. And, but it's really about organizing an organization and structuring. And that's where I kind of situate myself. I like to create order and structure to things. And that's kind of how I like to ask the whys. I'm not a micromanaging type of a person, but I do like to do my own research and look at how others are doing it. And I really feel that that brings some added insight into how I operate. Okay, a little bit about me. So as you can see from these two pictures, I like to travel. I also like education, but both my personal education, but also college affordability. So my doctoral research kind of went into the realm of college affordability. And that's kind of some of the key aspects I really enjoy in life. I also like doing family history, so I usually, well, I don't usually, but often incorporate my family history travel into my regular trips. So it's kind of a fun thing to do. My most famous relative, I like the DNA testing. I've done about every DNA test out there. And my closest famous relative is Butch Cassidy, which doesn't necessarily align very well with finance, but
I think it aligns very well.
there's a connection. Anyway, that's a little bit about me. So those are I do like hiking as well. So part of my, probably one of my biggest strengths is the diversification of my education. So I went to school at Southern Utah University. I studied political science and Spanish, and I was a history minor. I also was an accounting major at one point. I decided to switch and move I got a certificate in public administration, emphasis accounting, and then went on to BYU. It was kind of a decision. I always planned to get a master's degree, but that's the direction I went. So I went to BYU for my master's, and then while I was at my first job out of college, was working at the Legislative Auditor General's office. And I decided that I wanted to become a certified internal auditor. So I took more accounting classes. I enrolled at SLIC, so this is after my master's degree, and took some cost accounting and more governmental accounting and passed that exam. So I'm a CIA, certified internal auditor, and I did auditing for 10 years. For the legislature, and very difficult bosses. Sometimes they want you fired, but I was staff to the legislature. And then I got recruited to be at the Board of Higher Education. And I was the manager of audit and financial services, but then that expanded to not only audit, I would get involved with scholarshiping with the WICHE program, the Western Interstate Compact for Higher Education. I try to diversify really my experience. And I was also a budget analyst, and that is when I first met Vice President Linda Macon, who has been a good mentor for me over the years, but I've known her for 15 years. And Vice President Peterson, I've known for 15 years as well. So a lot of long-term connections here at UVU. Anyway, I tried to, again, the variation in my career experience. When I had the opportunity, I got out of auditing. No offense to the auditors, Peter, but it's budget and planning is where one of my great loves, and that's strategic thinking and kind of aligning my past work experience. And when I look at working at the legislative auditor's office, we would do performance audits and program evaluations, looking for ways to make process improvement. I'm really passionate about policy, and I feel like policy is the way we make change in life for many different processes, and especially when we're helping marginalized communities. So that's kind of where I kind of connected. I did a lot of social services audits and K-12 audits when I was at the legislature. But working at Salt Lake Community College, I work on a lot of the strategic initiatives. I work with the legislative offices still, reviewing the legislation and bills, and some cool projects I've worked on there. And I'll share those in a little bit. But some of the work-related projects I'm currently doing. So we're kind of separating out our technical college portion of Salt Lake Community College. So you might see things for Salt Lake Technical College. That is our branded name. And we're doing a lot of work to kind of get program alignment going on. So I'm working a lot with the academic affairs, getting the tuition schedules up, and then how it will align with curriculum. So I really like those aspects. We're also an emerging HSI, similar to UVU. We're pretty close to becoming an HSI, but we have a little bit of work to do. So that is Hispanic Serving Institution. And there's some grant funding that comes with that. So we're always looking for it's a way to grow alternative resources for the college. And anyway, it's just brings in money. But the thing is, it's been rolled out in a way that when the campus community, the stakeholders, aren't aware of some of these programs, it can actually ostracize groups of people. When you don't have that involvement from the get-go. We were in a group meeting, and most of the campus was in the room when it was introduced, but people were just caught off guard. So I think there's some initiatives I've learned over the years that you really do have to get the stakeholder involvement, and I think that's really important. So another piece is my dissertation work was working with undocumented students. And then I did a lot of work with UD Lewis when she was here. She was one of my classmates at the U of U. So I got a PhD in education, leadership, and policy. But I kind of, from that education, I went on to, so I did a lot of work, did a full study on undocumented students. I reviewed for 16 years how they've attended college, how many graduated, and I used Salt Lake Community College was my center for how I researched, but I also interviewed across the whole system, so every institution of degree granting institution on their processes. So I did some qualitative work as well. And what I found is that of our 1,700 students in 16 years that used the waiver, about 200 finished an associate's degree. 75 of those 1,700 transferred, and only 50, I say only 50 because you start seeing the barriers that students can encounter to finish. And then I looked at the grades of students and seeing the stopping out rates. That's one of my passions. It's like, well, is it affordability? Is it scholarshiping? Are there other issues? But sometimes it was grades. And when a student takes a class like Math 1010, 9 or 10 times, and this is real, and they get an F each time, where are the interventions? We're supposed to have interventions, but the interventions weren't triggering. So it all interconnects with how I see life and why I feel like the role of CFO needs to be diversified beyond finance, beyond budgeting, and that there's an aspect of planning and how are we helping students? How are we supporting academic affairs? Budget and finance sees the money. So we're always going to be part of the planning processes. So I think that's really essential. Another cool thing is, again, going back to the refugees that we have coming into the state. So I was one of the initiators on this project. So we were looking at providing, first of all, free ESL, so our English as a second language curriculum for free. We teach it in the tech college side and on the degree granting side. And as we were going through some of the kind of the roadblocks to doing that, we noticed that who are our ESL students? A lot of people think they automatically defer to the undocumented population, but most of the youth, if they came up as a young child, they're actually pretty fluent, and they're not in the ESL program. But a lot of the refugees are in that program, as well as the asylum seekers, and we also have the international students. So you start seeing who is using that, and we didn't have good data, so that's one of my pet peeves is when we don't have the data on some of these pieces. But as we work through it, trying to allow for this free ESL program, I'm like, when you have refugees and asylum seekers that are one of the big users, but they're not going to get resident status. So paying that non-resident tuition is very difficult, and the expectation of what we're doing with some of these populations. So I worked with our legislative rep and got the ball rolling on a law to allow refugees to get resident status. So this is a new law that just passed, just barely. And we still have to figure out now how tuition and scholarshiping works on this program. But you can see where my passion is to try to work through and create true pathways. Look at the things that are blocking students, and see if we can make any changes. But to me, it's like, well, it does play into how we look at college affordability and who we need to help bring into the college or into the university. So those are some of the recent projects I've been working on, but I work with academic affairs and the faculty with, we call it discussion team. So it's faculty workload, the handbook, compensation. I've been doing that for 8.5 years. And, but I love working on rolling out new programs. And I have some pieces where I'll talk through some scenarios, but it's kind of one of my joys. I do like to, as I mentioned, I do like to find ways to help disenfranchised and marginalized populations. A lot of that is listening and making sure that we're hearing points of view from these students. Working with the undocumented population, a lot of times they're like, oh, well, they can come into the advisors, or, oh, they can just come into admissions if they have any questions. But when you start understanding the population, which you have to take the time to understand the population, that trying to stay in the shadows is where they operate, which is when they're failing a class, they often don't get help. But I think that's taking the time to really listen, and that's one of my traits I feel I'm pretty good at, and I could bring to this position. And then process improvement and efficiencies. This is one of the areas where, again, it comes from performance auditing and program evaluation. I'm involved with the academic program review, setting up the template for what that's going to look like and rolling that out, and then making adjustments, and then making sure departments are having program review. And no one likes too many of these reviews, but it's really good to have an outside person come in and look at your operation. All right, so I'm going to go through a quick scenario of how I kind of think through. We were asked to look through how do we start a new academic program. And so we've started a few, but sometimes it's also moving programs around. So like our farm tech program, we bounced it from like self-support to the tech college to the degree granting side, and I think it's going back to tech. Anyway, we have a mixed bag when we're working through these issues, but I'll kind of walk through how I look at program development. So these are new academic programs. So with anything that we start, any student success program, We should always align it with the mission, vision, and institutional goals. That's essential to kind of help keep us on track. And then developing a new academic program, you need to have market research, see what the demand is, that students are actually going to want to take your program. And then also, I don't like to reinvent the wheel. So in that sense, you have to have these conversations, look at other institutions in the state, look at any research that's been done. So I think that's imperative in how we go about developing a new academic program. All right, and then identifying the startup costs. So the primary startup costs of any program are the faculty. So there's also going to be one-time startup costs and maybe developing or remodeling a space to get the program up and going. So the one thing that UVU has that is awesome is, it's flexible resources. So there are some reserves. It's important to have healthy reserves in order to be able to turn on a dime. But our primary source of revenue for the state is our new tax from the legislature. So that's something that I'm very involved with, been involved with in different realms, but 15 years directly, and then working as legislative staff, kind of got involved there. So then this is another piece where I see a lot of programs failing. When you start to roll out a new academic program, is who's marketing this and whose role is that? We have centralized marketing at Salt Lake Community College, but that kind of fell apart during the pandemic. There wasn't very good. Things started falling off the bus. So you start realizing how important that is, making sure your websites are up to date when you start to roll out a program, and then how are we going to access those students who would be interested in the academic program. And then enrollment goals should be instituted. We don't put too much weight into this. UVU has low tuition. Salt Lake Community College has low tuition, relatively speaking. So it takes a lot of students to really develop enough revenue to make additional, adding in another faculty. But most of the tuition goes to help institutional operations. If your institutional operations budgets are good and strong, then you can start looking at your new tuition coming in to add positions on that revenue. It's part of our education in general revenue source, which is across the system, except for the U, because they have so many other pots of money. That is our primary source of funds. And then an annual assessment. So I see this, I pull my hair out, bless student affairs, and I if there's somebody from student affairs here, but sometimes we roll out these new programs and there's no goal, there's no assessment plan. And one thing, when I looked at the study on the undocumented students using the HB 144 tuition waiver, that was part of it. It just rolled out. And it's there was try to be some type of organization, but now there's differences across how we interpret that law across the whole system. And then what is the end goal? Was the end goal to help students just to get in the door, or was it to complete? So when you have these gaps in what you really are trying to look for, and when you roll out a new program, I think sometimes it sounds good and it feels good, but then if you don't do assessment, you can't make those corrections. So with the HB 144 students, a lot of them were slipping through the cracks, and we're supposed to have tools in place, but without doing any assessment, there was no way to really find out what was really stopping these students, causing these students to stop out. So this is a little bit more detail of how I go about for resource planning. So sorry about the small print, but I tried to get it as big as possible. So collaboration with academic affairs, planning, budget, and institutional research. That's usually where I've seen it, but business industry might approach academic affairs. They might approach the president and try to get a program going. A legislator may want a program to get up and going. So there's different pieces, but usually from the get-go, it's going to involve many departments, but at least this group of people need to be involved in the forefront. The next piece is the new faculty costs. The primary source that we're going to be looking for is the new legislative appropriations. It's coming in the form of performance funding, and that is creating some problems, which I'll talk about shortly. I work with Vice President Macon on this. I think we're the two main people in the system that kind of like watch for like the crazy parts of new rollouts of system ideas that, anyway, sometimes they just don't work as well as they think they are going to work. And then the tuition revenue projected from the goal enrollment. We can also use, there's some other prompts that when I was doing this presentation that they wanted us to address. So grant funds are really important, but they come one time. And so when you start a new program, you can start a new academic program, but you have to be cognizant that this money is going to run out and when's it going to transition. It's great to explore different programs this way, but oftentimes I get pulled in saying, help us find the money, and we've already, like, depending on how our reserves are, it kind of takes some time to move things along. The one-time funds are from your reserves, and we just finished our capital campaign. Now, the capital campaign, I know you're just starting yours. Vice President Reyes was one of my faculty members when I was in my graduate program, but I've known Kyle for quite a long time. But when we look at the fundraising goals and what is the purpose and use of those funds, and most of the time it's for like either a new building or it goes into your endowment or to provide scholarships or along those lines. It's usually not to start a new academic program. But there might be some initiatives that people are willing to donate to the university. And I think it's also important, I know that you're rolling out an employee giving campaign. That was one thing I worked on with Slick as we rolled out our capital campaign, that we had involvement from the campus community and how it's kind of a fun thing that you could get behind and help the campus get involved with the fundraising piece. And then the reallocation of resources. So this is big for us at Salt Lake Community College because we have declining enrollment. We dropped 1,000 FTE students per year since the pandemic started, which you talk about enrollment declines, that is like, it is steady free fall. So we do budget reductions each year. We just did an early retirement incentivizing program because we have to shrink the size of our institution. So we repurpose and reallocate resources. Sometimes it's completely eliminating the position, but often it's just, we have an open faculty position that's been open for 4 years. We collapsed one last year to give raises to 30 faculty that just fell below market. So there's ways to create revenue or find revenue, but it has to be the willingness across the campus to kind of look at those items. But we probably reallocate, like I said, it's anywhere from 30 to 50 positions. And most of the time it's not for budget reduction, but that is one thing we have used it for. And then one thing we look at Salt Lake Community College, because we've had such steep declines, low enrollment programs and low completion programs. So this kind of ties back into the performance metrics, and a lot of people don't love the performance metrics, but that is the world we're living in order to get money. So we kind of adapt and make adjustments, but we're going to be looking at the high yield graduates, so programs that are deemed high yield, high wage earning programs. So we have to make sure that academic affairs is supported in that way. And then timely completion is another, which is tricky. And it's tricky for open enrollment institutions, which you view as an open enrollment institution. But we're going to be graded against ourselves on that. And then the access goal. Now, UVU is one of the few institutions in the state that that have the biggest growth. And we're going to be judged on that across the system. So it's like they don't want us competing against each other, so it's a total access goal. And but UVU is needed in order for us to meet that goal, just because of the number of students that UVU has. anyway, we look at the low enrollment and completion programs because completions become more and more important. And then I just kind of put together some points just as I close out, just what to expect from me in this position as CFO. So I believe CFOs are changing from just being pure finance. You really do have to have diversification and as more like chief operating officers. So knowledge of a lot of different things. And I think that's very important, but I love the research. I work very closely with, like I said, Vice President Macon and Scott Wood when we're looking at analysis across the state, and we need some quick comparisons, adjunct faculty rates, compensation increases, and having those connections is one thing that I would bring to this position. I've worked with every institution's budget officers and vice presidents of finance, so I had those connections. And then student academic success is important for every one of us. This is why we work in higher education, and that's something that I like to see those initiatives, but I would just like to see more assessment done, and if we need to make any modifications or changes, we can do so. And then the performance metrics and funding, I've worked with this modeling since its inception. I do feel like we've gone too far into just performance funding is where we're at. And we used to have mission-based fund and working with mission-based funding, and with Salt Lake Community College, we have so many first-generation students. UVU has quite a few first-generation students, and yet there's no funding source anymore for that. It's completely gone. So even the last performance metrics at least tried to accommodate for that. So that is a concern, and that is one thing I would push for the system office. I think there's just some problems with just having all on performance. Another thing is we've been pushing performance since 2015, 16, and there's only so much you can grow and really change. So anyway, that's something to watch. I think it just puts us in a bind down the road, but sometimes at the system office, they're like, as long as we get money, we don't care what happens, but the long term. So I kind of look at long-term impacts. I would be doing a listening tour the first 6 months, but I'm a listening person. I like to be in the room where it happens, but just listening to what's going on, I piece things together. So I think my background in the various areas of working at the system office, knowing how to get funding, how to move projects along, I think those are some of my skill sets I do very well at. I don't micromanage, but if I find information that might help your area, I'm going to pass it along. That's one thing I do. I might prod if it's really an awesome program, but anyway. And then a strong balanced budget. I know UVU has a strong balanced budget. Even Salt Lake Community College with our declining enrollment. I told the president, I go, well, there will be a point where we stop declining at some point, but just making sure that we keep rebalancing the budget, and that's something I work on without raising tuition more than what we have to for compensation matching. So, and then the final piece is the operating budget request development. I'm not entirely sure how it's developed here, but I'm very involved in that when it goes to the system office and the projects. So a lot of the ideas we get from, I know you have the program, it's PBF? PBA. Ours are IBP. So those initials, informed budget process is what we call it. But things that don't get funded, like this year, I run the cabinet budget meetings, and we're identifying any EDI requests that came in, equity, diversity, inclusion, to kind of highlight that, to make sure that we're paying attention to those items. And then we're planning next year's as we're going through this year's budget decision making, so that we already know the direction we want to go next year. So ideally we have these 5-year plans, but I know I'm just happy when we get 2 to 3 years plans. So and then assessment efficiency. It's one of those things. I'm an accreditor with volunteer with Northwest. I have an accreditation coming up next week. It's been great exposing me to multiple facets of academic affairs and student affairs. I work more on the finance side, but we work together as we do those accreditation visits. But you learn so much, and you realize the importance that, wow, when you don't have that assessment and looking for ways to improve through efficiency, it really does create, it makes things clunky across the college. It can really impact, compound as it goes along. And I think with accountability, I think that's another piece where I feel like I've seen different institutions suffer when their cabinet members don't hold people accountable. And anyway, that would be a piece where I'm a pretty fun-loving person, and I generally care about individuals. But I mean, part of me is like the audit hat. I'm like, yeah, but you still have to do X, Y, Z. And so that accountability piece is part of who I am, but in a caring way. So anyway, that's kind of what to expect from me. And I'm now open. I want to just say thank you, but I'm now open for any questions that you may have.
We were having some issues on hearing the questions last time around, so we're going to be passing out a microphone with any questions this time.
Okay.
But let me go ahead and kick that off real quick. I'm going to follow up on a question that I actually asked you during your interview. I know that fundraising is not specifically a part of the CFO, Vice President of Finance job. That's going to be Kyle Ray's job. But there is going to be integration, particularly into the budget function. And you've had a lot of vision into who does it well at USHE. I think everybody knows that the U is really the 800-pound gorilla on fundraising.
Yeah.
But UVU being the largest university, we have a need. How do you see working with Vice President Reyes on developing a very successful evergreen campaign?
Well, I think just to answer that, because it's one thing, we just got done with our capital campaign. Now, your goal is way bigger than ours. We started at 40 million and we are ending with 50 million, but it's supporting. So one thing we did was carve out additional funding, and we even did we used one-time funds to bolster the number of people who are out fundraising and having that good support function. So you have to make sure your structure meets the goal. That if one person is bringing in, like one new fundraising individual is bringing in $2 million a year, very well worth the money that's put into that. So I think proper resourcing, but then I also think it's important to be out in the community. And so at events, we're all kind of ambassadors for the institution. And so as we know people who might be able to donate, I think that's kind of a big thing. So I do like interacting with people, meeting with people. So I think being visible is important of the CFO, but I think initially also resourcing is what I would put my efforts into.
Thank you, Darren.
Wait, does it? Oh, there it goes. Okay. You mentioned in your presentation, that you bless student affairs and the start of of programs and things like that. When you made that comment, were you referring to programs that were implemented by student affairs without further thought, or were you referring more to mandated initiatives that come from the state?
Okay, so I'm going to throw one out that just to answer your question. So our president comes from student affairs. So, but how we rolled out so we started Summer Bridge. And I said, you know what, UVU, I knew some of the work that UD Lewis did with some of the Latinx issues, and then how Summer Bridge is run down here. And we rolled it out with federal stimulus money. So this is where, and now it's created this, it's a $3 million cost that was covered with federal stimulus money that now we have to come up with $3 million to sustain it at its current level. So so that's not sustainable for how much resources we have. So it's kind of trying to develop like what should our summer bridge program look like. Those are the types of things that that I know we have duplication of types of services. So we've ballooned out our ODMA, so our Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs, and our advising and our student success coaches. And then there's so many different programs, they start overlapping on who students contact for information. It might not be the best source. So I think just having that clear review of these programs and departments. But like we rolled out the PACE program. I think you have a PACE program, but I'm not sure if it's the same PACE. But where we start in the high schools and then help them continue on through their associate's degree is our PACE. And so we just never had data on how well the students were doing. Were they coming to college? Were they completing? And when we're meeting with the legislature, because we've invested a lot of resources into this program, there's just not the data. And then it's November, December, and we have to come up with how the program is doing for presentations in January. So that's kind of where I'm kind of situating it. It's almost a reflection more of leadership in general, and not really a reflection on the departments running the program. So does that help?
Yeah, just wanted to see if you were a student affairs hater.
No. I'm actually I'm a very strong supporter of student affairs.
Good answer. Okay, so follow up with that.
Yeah.
If you were selected for this vice president role, UVU stands by we use shared governance throughout campus on multiple levels. And so how would you view your interactions in your role with student affairs as a whole? You spoke to academic affairs and developing academic programs, but what is your approach in collaborating, and how do you see yourself fit in that area?
Thank you. So I can just say, like my dissertation work, it was student retention, student success. And so, but particularly for undocumented students, but I did a lot of Latinx research on that topic. So there's my love for student affairs is definitely there, but how does that play out as this role? So primarily it's resource planning, but to me it's not about, like when I say assessment and accountability, it's that extra added piece. Like when students, we're supposed to have interventions in place when we roll out some of these programs, and when we realize that by doing the assessment, we see that it's not really working as intended. So that's where you can make adjustments. It's not that the program needs to go away, but it's like what is happening that might be impacting our students, that it's not being as successful as it can be. So I think I would say at Salt Lake Community College, probably 2/3 of our new funding goes to student affairs projects. My role currently in budget is to make sure it's spent in the area that it was allocated. And I think that's important. We've built in some assessments to our IBP where we ask for updates for over 2 years, but it's just the handoff points. And I think, definitely it's just one of those pieces where when we roll out new programs, often we don't think about those added pieces, like what was our goal? So when you talk to the individuals running the department and running the whatever the program is, and I name student affairs because we have so many of those type of initiatives that we look at, and then when nobody knows the goal or what the purpose of what they're really trying to aim, it makes them frustrated because they don't know what they're aiming for. So that's what I kind of want to refer to. And I think, finance helps run its resourcing, but our legislature really wants that accountability too. So we're asked to report back on how these programs are doing. And so the clearer that you have assessment built in, it helps build our presentations that we do to the legislature each year. We all do them. Every institution does them, and I work extensively on that. But I'm a support person. I whatever it is, emotional support or financial supporting person, pretty passionate about that. Does that help? You're welcome. I'm not a hater.
So you talked a little bit about allocating funds and
Yeah.
how you've done that at Slip. Tell us a little bit about your approach if you have to take away funds from a certain area. How do you approach that conversation and everything with whoever you're talking to in that area?
So currently we do that. So we usually work with the cabinet members and cabinet to send the message first. So there's not like this cold approach. So how we've been doing a lot of our taking the money away, it's from open positions. So we're looking at length of open positions, how long they, and really seeing along those lines. So I think you have to look at whatever the program or area is, because each division has had to do budget reductions each year. So we work with the vice presidents they're the ones who know their areas the best. But when you have to take money away, fortunately we don't have to do that a lot. I mean, Salt Lake Community College is doing the most, but we're getting more tax funds in than we actually have to reduce. So it really is more of a reallocation. I think clear communication is important regardless. That communication should be supported by your leadership across the college or institution. That's how I would do it. Most people can understand if you explain, as long as you're open and communicating the why you're doing what you're doing. Most people are able to handle a lot better than just cold taking away money. So does that help at all? Okay, thank you. I don't have very many green clothes. That's my that's my stress. Go ahead.
So you mentioned with this other question that you had to report you didn't have the data.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that be part of your responsibility to make sure when you're allocating funds in the first place that the data is going to be there when you have to report on something? How would you make that allocation decision before that data is even there?
So sometimes. Okay. So the question is, like, how do we make the decision to allocate resources when we don't have any data on the program? This is where the research from, I would say when it's a new academic program, for instance, this is where usually it's going to be initiated by either a business industry or a faculty member. So it's ideally bringing in the research from the get-go and saying this is what the market is showing. So you have other data in order to make good judgment on allocating resources. But sometimes the legislature just says you're expanding nursing. It might not be your number one priority across the institution, but then they give you $300,000 for nursing. And you don't have a choice but to kind of go down that road. And that happens. Every year there's something that just comes out. So I would say, but as you expand and allocate more resources, that's when you probably need to do more of the assessment. Like, is this program working before we put more resources into it? So, that help? Okay.
Any other questions? Well, Darren, thank you very much for your time today. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.